Welcome all to this year's celebration of Samhain, the end of the harvest and the start of the long cold. In truth, though many will celebrate the festival on All Hallows Eve, it has always coincided traditionally with the first full moon after the final harvest moon. This places the real Scottish Samhain on November the 15th. But how and where you celebrate the harvest and give thanks to the Sidhe and spirits is not my concern. I am here today to bring you an old tale of a classic haunting. Ensure the protective fires are burning, the house is warm, and you have no need to travel, as this night the barrier is weak, and the spirits of the otherworld cross with ease. So join me in the warm glow, and hear the tale of the ghostly prior of Pittenweem. Some years ago, in the mid-19th century, an old sailor by the name of Captain Chester purchased a fine house on the outskirts of St Andrews. There he took in his brother, a nephew and 3 nieces. To care for the family and the property, the captain took 3 women into his service. All were said to be English, and due to that, they had what Chester believed was some of the strangest names he had ever heard. The first was the matriarch and cook, Maria Trombone, then the housemaid, Jemima Poddage, and last was Teresa Shadbolt. Now, it was not long after the family and the servants moved into the old house that strange happenings began to occur. On one evening, when the fine captain was resting with a full pipe in his study, the door was suddenly thrown open, and in rushed Maria the cook in a great fluster. "What's the meaning of all this commotion?" called the poor captain as he dropped his pipe in shock. The terrified woman did not even take time to apologise before she dived headlong into her explanation. Apparently, as the cook was washing up for the day, she began to hear a rustle around the kitchen. Then something or someone ran past her, causing her to scream. She hunted for whatever the creature was, whatever had just ran past her, but searching all the cupboards and pantries, she could find nothing. And just as she was beginning to believe it was all fake, she felt a cold, clammy hand slap her hard across the face. It was then she took off running to the captain's study and arrived in her present state. "Nonsense, Trombone," said the captain, righting himself. "You'd either fallen asleep or you were at the wine again." Now the cook swore to the man that she had been awake and had not touched a drop that day. In fact, this was far from the first time such hauntings had taken place, but the staff had never wanted to bother the old captain before. All the women were called for and asked to verify this wild story, and that they did. Teresa Shadbolt told of how she retired to bed some nights ago, once her chores were done. She dressed in her nightwear and climbed into bed. Then as she tried to sleep, the room suddenly became ice cold, and she felt as if there was movement round the bed. Suddenly, the sheets were torn off the woman, and she screamed. But sitting bolt upright, she could see nothing in the room. Shadbolt tried to reason with herself, and eventually calming, went to return to sleep. But it was not to be, as once more the sheets were torn from the bed, and now deathly afraid, she heard the Eerie Phantom breathing in the corner of the room. She flew open the door and ran down the corridor, calling for Miss Trombone. Now the housemaid spoke, and told the captain of an evil which lived within his house. She had seen doors unlocked, windows fly open, bells ringing during the midnight hours, and phantom footsteps all around the house. At night she was plagued by terrible sounds, the howl of dogs and blood-curdling screams of a dying man. She would tell the captain no Christian could be asked to live in this nightmare, and we all must go. Now the old captain, being a shrewd man of the world, did not believe for one instant that the women's talk of spirits and phantoms were true. but each of them was a good worker, and he had never heard complaints from them before, so quickly he remedied the issue with words of logic, sense, and an increase in wages, along with the agreement that the women could share one of the larger bedrooms upstairs to protect each other from the wicked spirits. And this seemed to work and keep peace, at least for a while. After some time, the captain's nephew and nieces seemed to collaborate the haunting tales of the serving women. And it all started on one night when the captain was awoken by the screaming of the girls. He rushed to their room and found them shaking with fear. They said that an old man with a long white beard had been at the bottom of their bed, staring intently at them until the screams sounded and the figure seemed to vanish. The captain's nephew then told of how he had seen just such a man on many occasions, walking through the house or climbing the stairs. It always happened at night, and for many weeks the boy just believed it to be shadows or his imagination until he heard the girl's tale. Soon the old captain became a little more uneasy. Perhaps there was a haunting phantom, or at the very least, someone unexpected was in his house. It was only now that the captain himself began to experience strange phenomena. One evening, again in his study with a good full pipe, the man was startled by a great rumbling and smashing, as if someone was bowling great stone boulders beneath the house. The man jumped to his feet, but as he was about to open the door, the unearthly noise suddenly stopped, and he was assailed by an intolerable silence. At dawn of the next morning, the captain hired a private detective to search through the house with a fine-toothed comb, but it was to no avail. The detective found nothing out of the ordinary. This would then lead to a string of wise women, psychics, occultists, and members of the clergy searching the house, each in their own way, but all of them were at a loss. None could offer an explanation or a resolution for the haunting. But then one night, the captain overheard some sailors talking in a local pub. They were telling great tales of Scotland's past and present, and one mentioned a connection between the captain's very house and the final prior of Pittenweem. Apparently, the old monk had went into hiding, and the house was his last known location. The captain, in a fluster, jumped from his seat and quickly bought around for all the sailors and demanded that they told him everything they knew of the old prior. Their tale took place during a time in Scottish history known as the Reformation, where many Scottish people broke away from the Catholic Church and established the Protestant Church of Scotland, which would no longer come under the rule of the Papistry. This, as you can imagine, caused no end of political and religious upheaval in Scotland, with militiamen and soldiers dying daily for their beliefs. But not only did their tale occur during the Reformation, but during a specific time period known as the Rough Wooing, an incredibly complicated time in Scottish history. But all you need know for our tale is that the English king had invaded Scotland to force a marriage between his son and Mary, Queen of Scots. The invasion devastated the southeast of Scotland. In a time some call the Burning of Edinburgh, the English navy would follow the coastline and bombard and destroy any village, church, castle or town they could see. And it is in this way that they burned the church of St. Monkins and the priory at Pittenweem. Now the prior of Pittenweem was one of the few that survived the English barrage. He escaped from the destruction with his life and little else. But the unfortunate prior had also been facing growing resentment for his Catholic beliefs, and he was already rumoured to be hunted by the Protestants, led by Lord James Stewart, Earl of Moray, who at the time were ransacking and destroying local Catholic priories. So the old monk did the only thing he could do, and went into hiding. First he would take up residence beneath Newark Castle. The few remaining monks of the priory would smuggle him food on a daily basis to keep him alive. But soon the castle was also burned by the English navy, and then the man fled to Balcony Castle in the north. But he would not stay there long, fearing that the castle may meet the same fate as Newark. The old prior took what food and supplies he could carry and went to the Kinkell Cave near St Andrews. There, hiding within the cave on the coast, he was certain that the English nor the Protestants would find him. And the man was right. For many long months, the old prior of Pittenweem lived within the cave, surviving off of seafood collected from the coast. But then the winter came, and the biting cold flew across the sea and directly into the cave. And so on one day, when he could stand the cold no more, he crept into the town in the darkness of night. Now it would seem that the prior had knew the occupants of what would one day become the captain's house, and thought of them as friends, or at the very least fellow Catholics. But perhaps the prior was too trusting. On that very night, the townsfolk were startled from their rest by the loud crack of gunpowder, followed by the clashing of blades and the screams of battle. What happened in the house that night, no one would ever know. But the old prior was never seen again. Of course, many suspected foul play or murder. Others told that the occupants had tipped off the Protestant militias. But at that time, it was best just to keep one's mouth shut and not get involved in the wars of others. This was the tale the captain was told that night in the pub, and perhaps this could be the answer to his question of what plagued his household. But it certainly did not rid him of the spectre, and in many ways it left the old man feeling more uneasy than he ever had before. He thanked the sailors and left them with another round, before returning home to fill a pipe and think of what to do. Days went by and the hauntings continued, the thunderous sounds, the old bearded apparition, and the harassment of the occupants. The captain tried everything he could think of to rid the house of this damned spirit, but no cleansing or religious ceremony seemed to work. Now the battle between the captain and the spirit of the old prior would come to a head on the very night of Samhain, or All Hallows Eve as the Christians call it. This was the time when all spirits wander abroad in the world of the living, and phantoms and apparitions gain more power and strength than any other night. That evening, the family dined early, and the staff then went to barricade themselves in the bedroom before the darkness fell and the eerie prior returned to the house. But the captain would not cower away from such things as spirits, and he was content in doing as he has done every other night of the year. He poured a strong glass of whiskey and filled his pipe before sitting by the fire with a good book. Now it was as the man went to light his pipe, an earth-shattering crash sounded from all around. The captain leapt to the floor, covering his head, thinking that the very roof had fallen in. But nothing landed upon him. He rushed to the door, only to hear a horrific human roar which chilled him to his very bones. Looking back, the fire had died, and the captain was shrouded in darkness. He struck a match and lit a lamp, and began to investigate the house. Now as the captain crept from room to room, he could not see anything to account for the crash or the roar, and each corridor and hallway seemed as silent and eerie as it did on any other night. Finally, he pushed open the kitchen door, and his heart seemed to stop, as his eyes beheld a horrific sight. A terrified scream was torn from the petrified old captain. A tall, thin man, with shaved head and a long white beard, wearing what would seem to the captain an old Augustinian habit or robe. In one of the thin, bony hands rested a rosary, and in the other a stout walking stick. The haunting phantom seemed far more terrifying this night than he had ever heard it described before. The captain tried with all his might to run, to scream, to even move was impossible. The dead eyes of the prior burned deep into the captain's soul, and an otherworldly voice beckoned him closer. Without any input from the captain himself, His body began to move closer and closer, step by step towards the spectre. He was hypnotized or controlled by the spirit, and as he walked closer, the prior seemed to levitate backwards, until the pair had entered a small door in the corner of the kitchen, one which the captain had never noticed before. As he entered the room, the prior became more and more transparent, and soon vanished with another unworldly roar. The man regained his senses momentarily. His trembling hands dropped the lamp, which shattered on the floor, plunging everything into a black abyss. There, silence reigned, and the man thought that he would never know light again as he fell from consciousness. The captain suddenly awoke in his own bed on the morning of November the 1st. He leapt from the sheets and ran to the kitchen, where Miss Trombone was preparing breakfast. Throwing the door open, the captain entered in his manic state. His eyes went directly to where the door had been the previous evening. "Where is the door?" he screamed at the cook. But poor Miss Trombone did not have an answer for him. Not only was she frightened by his wild appearance, but she had no idea what door the captain spoke of. "There has never been a door, sir. Only the one you entered." "Nonsense!" called the captain. "There was a door. I know there was a door." He told the cook to run into town and fetch a party of workmen and tell them to come immediately. So she did, and soon the kitchen was filled with various workmen from the town, along with the old captain, still in his bedclothes. The men quickly set to work, and under the captain's orders, began to tear down the plaster and wood of the kitchen wall, and in no time at all, they uncovered a small yet sturdy oak door, nail-studded and iron-bound. They heaved and pushed, and after some considerable effort, they forced the door open. They all entered what was a dark, stone-flagged chamber about 6 foot square. But to the captain's dismay, there was nothing there to be found. "Tear up the floor," the mad captain demanded, and so the men did. About an hour later, they lifted a huge round flagstone, and beneath it was the entrance to an old well. The captain called for lamps and rope, and soon the mad old man was being lowered down into the darkness beneath his house. There at the bottom, he found the decayed remains of a tall skeleton. Beside the bones on one side lay a large rosary, and to the other a stout walking stick. It had to be the remains of the old prior who had vanished so mysteriously in that very house hundreds of years ago. The captain breathed a sigh of relief, and the madness that grasped him seemed to diminish. He ordered the remains to be removed from the well, and buried with all the necessary honours and rites. And from that day on, the haunting apparition of the last prior of Pittenweem would never bother the captain nor his family again. The spirit had finally found rest, and whatever evil was done had now been rectified. Thank you for listening, and a special thank you to all my patrons who help me keep these tales alive. This is your classic haunting story, the restless spirit that remains in this plane till avenged or granted a proper burial. Now this tale, from all accounts, is a true story and was told by the very captain himself to one William Thomas Linskill, who wrote of the tale in his book St. Andrew's Ghost Stories. However, I did find some slightly contradicting information, or perhaps just some confusion, depending on the interpretation, since there was 2 James Stewarts who held the title of the Earl of Moray. One who died in the same year as the burning of Edinburgh in 1544, and his nephew, who would become the Scottish regent for 3 years, before being the first head of government to be assassinated using a firearm. This second Earl of Moray was also a strong supporter of the Scottish Reformation, which suggests that he is the Moray from the tale, although he would only be 13 at the time of the burning, and had not yet begun his enthusiastic Protestant support. This is perhaps a very small contradiction, but it's something I noticed while trying to research the truth of this tale. As for the identity of the prior, I am not entirely sure. The records show that a William Skeeves was the last serving prior at the Pittenweem Priory, but he died in 1497, some 50 years before the rough wooing. Now there is a list of commendators, or people who were responsible for the priory's land after the last prior, and interestingly enough, they show the second James Stewart and Earl of Murray as owning the land from 1550 to 1567, which adds another level of confusion into the tale, making me think that the castles may have already been destroyed by the time the prior got there, and the tale is set a little later than I first thought. Perhaps our mysterious prior of Pittenweem was only a caretaker or monk who had lived in the priory, continuing his outlawed religious practices until the Earl of Murray gained the land and sought to oust or even kill the caretaker for his ongoing allegiance to the Pope. This would certainly give the man a reason to run and hide, and perhaps the exact timeline or the profession of the prior or monk was unknown to the captain and the sailors, and due to this tale being told so much later, the difference between 1544 and 1550 may not have seemed like a discrepancy in the timeline. But that is all the information I could find out about this mysterious prior. Of course, if you yourself happen to know more, I would love to hear about it in the comments below. I hope you have enjoyed this spooky Samhain tale, and I will see you all again soon. But until then, Eich na hau na hana hoot. Slán